Hello, it's 5 o'clock here in London, so I think we should probably get going. Welcome to this Institute for Jewish Policy Research event. My name is Jonathan Boyd. I'm the Executive Director of JPR, and I'm going to be hosting the event today. And we're really delighted that you have joined us. We've got researchers and academics here from all over the world. And we're looking forward to sharing with you a newly published and I think unique, really, JPR report, which offers a really interesting perspective on both the nature and development of social research about Jews in Europe over the course of the past 30 years. But before we start, let me just say a word or two about JPR. JPR is an independent research institute based in the UK that specialises in studying Jewish populations and issues of concern to them here in the UK, across Europe, and indeed around the world. Our work is very much policy oriented. We generate data specifically to support community life, and we touch on multiple topics, including demography, education, identity, social care and welfare, health, economics, anti-Semitism and Israel diaspora relations, among many, many others. But our topic today is actually something of a departure from our usual work. Typically, our studies take a deep dive into a very particular issue, because our interest is in generating data to help specific organizations to better understand an issue of concern to them. But this new study is rather different. It takes one giant step away from day-to-day community concerns to kind of climb up onto the balcony overlooking all research conducted about Jews in Europe over the past 3 decades. And it attempts to paint an overarching portrait comprised of numerous individual studies that we've all been involved in conducting over the past 30 years. It reminds me a little bit of a present I was given for a recent birthday, a print made up of thousands of tiny photos, each beautiful in its own way, but that when put together in a particular manner, create a single large recognizable image. Now, I wouldn't know how to go about doing that, but in the case of this study, we had a really incredible tool at our disposal. Several years ago, we received a generous grant from the Rothschild Foundation Hanadiv Europe to create our European Jewish Research Archive, which is a free to access online archive of all research conducted on Jews across Europe since 1990. And with that grant, we were able to employ Dr. Kahn-Harris, the author of this new report, and we invested in building the technological infrastructure required to house an online archive. Slowly but surely, we began to populate the archive with every study, report, paper and journal article we could find. And at a certain point, after several years working on it, we were able to say with a strong degree of confidence that whilst the archive may not yet be fully comprehensive, there was enough in it to be able to take a first look at what the study of contemporary Jewry looks like in Europe today, and how research on that overarching topic has evolved over the past 30 years. And the result, I hope you'll agree, is a fascinating view of a field of study that, despite operating through multiple agencies and with few, if any, coordinating mechanisms, has a certain coherence to it that's intriguing in and of itself, whilst also raising lots of questions about the social scientific study of Jews in Europe today. So just before starting, I want to publicly thank the team at Rothschild for its support. The team led by Sally Berkovich. As many people at this event will know, Rothschild plays a really important role in supporting Jewish research and researchers across Europe. So we were really thrilled when they agreed to support the archive. Their funding's helped to create a resource that's proven to be invaluable to researchers across the continent, as well as to many Jewish organizations looking for information about specific topics. And actually, while I'm thanking people, I also want to publicly thank a member of the JPR team, Richard Goldstein, who's worked very closely with Keith to build the archive, focusing largely on the more of the sort of technological rather than the social scientific side of the work, but without whom we would simply not have been able to create the archive in the first place. But let me move on to the plan for this evening. In a moment, I'm going to invite Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris as Project Director of the archive and author of this report to present the findings from his research work. Keith holds a PhD in sociology from Goldsmith College London and has been engaged in social research on contemporary Jewish life since the mid-1990s. He's been commissioned by a variety of Jewish organizations to write various social research reports and has published multiple articles for a variety of publications. He's the author of 6 books, including with Ben Gidley, Turbulent Times, The British Jewish Community Today, and Uncivil War, The Israel Conflict in the Jewish Community. And as well as his role at JPR, he's a senior lecturer at Leo Beck College in London and holds visiting fellowships at the Pears Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism at Birkbeck College in London and at the Centre for the Study of Jewish Culture, Society and Politics at Durham University. But perhaps most importantly, he's a passionate social scientist, continually engaged in trying to understand key trends going on in Jewish life, always eager to make a contribution to the real issues of the day. Keith's going to present his findings for about half an hour or so, after which I'll pose some of my own questions to him, as well as fielding any questions that you have. So if you want to ask a question, feel free at any time during the event to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Just type in what you want to ask, and my role will be to process those questions and then raise them with Keith. Our time, of course, is limited. We only have an hour, but I'll do my best to cover as many of your questions as possible. So without further ado, let me hand over to my colleague, Project Director of the JPR European Jewish Research Archive and author of this new report, Dr. Keith Kahn-Harris.
Thank you very much, John, and I would like to repeat the thanks that John offered to Richard Goldstein and to the Rothschild Foundation, without whom none of this would be possible. Just to start off with, I'm looking at the participant list, and I'm delighted to see that there are a number of people that I've never met, that I don't know, but I feel I do know, because over the last few years, I have been putting up records of your research work onto the European Jewish Research Archive. And of course, it's part of the theme of this report is what brings this field together. And the fact that we don't know each other face to face in some ways tells its own story, that this is quite a disparate field and one where you need to work to bring it together. So I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation which presents some highlights from the report. I'll show the cover of the report in one of those slides. So if you give me 1 second. Everyone can see that? Sure, great. So I'm going to start just by explaining a little bit more about the European Jewish Research Archive, which you can find on the JPR website. If you go to the JPR homepage, you will see on the, I think it's the top right-hand bar, you'll see it says Jewish Europe Archive. If you click on that, you will find EJRA, the European Jewish Research Archive. Don't do it now, though. do it after this talk. And there's the URL as well if you need it. Now, EJRA was originally modeled on something that some of you may know about in the US called the Berman Jewish Policy Archive, which has been going, I think, for a couple of decades, and is an online repository with thousands, I think 10 to 20,000 items on it of interest to Jewish policymakers and academics in the US and worldwide. Like what's known as BJPA, our archive is also free to access, but our inclusion criteria are slightly different to what you find on BJPA. The other thing is that whilst we want to include a downloadable PDF of every item, if we can, we also include items for which we don't have permission to do that. As researchers on this webinar will know, a lot of academic research is paywalled. And when that happens, we include a link to that paywalled item. We have items from 54 countries in 29 languages on the archive, and we record a lot of different information for each item that we have. So we assign topics for each item, we record the country that it concerns, we record the language that it's in, as well as essential bibliographic information that could be used for citations. We have also created collections of items, special collections based around the work of particular authors. In fact, we have a couple of those authors on this call. We have Olaf Gluckner and Andreas Kovacs. And we also have collections based around particular topics. Our inclusion criteria are fairly broad in some respects and fairly strict in others. We define Europe fairly broadly. although we don't go out of our way to find it, if we do come across something on Georgia or Turkey, we do tend to include it. In terms of what we mean by social research, again, it's a fairly broad church, fairly broad synagogue that we are responding to. We have some things that are lengthy think pieces rather than social research in the strictest terms. Most importantly, all of the items on there are about Jews and Jewish populations, of course, but also how Jews and Jewish populations are viewed. So we have a lot of stuff on anti-Semitism. Now, to some extent, research on anti-Semitism can sometimes not be about Jews at all. It can be about perceptions of Jews, but that's all in the archive as well. Where we are fairly strict is that the archive, with a few exceptions, only contains work that has been published since 1990 and that covers developments that have occurred from 1990 inclusive. The reason for that date is partly because beyond that things would be fairly unmanageable, but also because there was a bit of that is a crucial date, or at least 1989 to 1991 is a crucial time period in the study of European Jewry, because that's the time of the fall of communism, when there was both an upsurge in research on European Jewry, people having a look to see what European Jewry would mean in this new, more unified continent, but also countries where research on Jews was sometimes difficult and where Jewish life was difficult, started to produce more research than they had previously. In terms of EDRA's aims, one of the things we're trying to do is to consolidate the field of research on contemporary European Jewish populations. As we will see, this is not a field of research that has one address, unless you count EDRA as that address. There is no one journal, there is no one scholarly association that brings people together. So we're trying to do our bit here to try and create connections between researchers and between research work. We also want to publicize the existence of this field, especially to researchers and potential researchers. So one of the things that we hope will be achieved here is that an MA or BA student who wants to do something on Jewish social research for research will discover the archive, and through discovering the archive, we'll see that there's a lot more stuff, and then maybe because of that, think there's something here for me to do a PhD on. We're also trying to enable access to the field, particularly to policymakers. We feel strongly at JPR, and I feel strongly personally, that the connection between policymaking and research should be symbiotic. But to do that, you have to make it easy for people to know that this stuff exists. We also want to encourage cross-country comparisons and collaboration. There is a tendency in many scholarly fields for people to become siloed by country or by subject area. What we hope we will do here is that someone looking at Jewish identity in young people in Hungary might be tempted into situating their work in a broader context. So the cover of the research is shown on the right. It's there. It's on the front page of the JPR homepage, and it's there to download. This is based on a piece of research on the archive as it was in the summer of 2019, where we had about 2,500 items. We've added more items since then, but I've done some checks and there is no reason to think that the trends we've identified are not still fairly robust. To do this research, it had to be quite innovative in how we approached it, but essentially we tried to treat it like we would any other, like a survey, if you like, by exporting the archive from the system that we use into SPSS and Excel. We were able to do the kinds of basic statistical tests and to try and find correlations within the data, treating it as a data set, in other words. The methodology for doing so was extremely challenging. There is a lengthy methodological appendix, and we hope at some time to repeat this research in a few years' time, and we'd certainly welcome your opinions on how we might do it in a different and better way in the future. So let's start by asking a very basic question. How much research is there on European Jewish populations, it should say, post-1990? Well, the key thing here is, whilst we do not have every last piece of research, there is a very clear trend towards growth within this field. You can see that it, whilst undoubtedly the figure we have for 1990 is a considerable underestimate, the figures that we have for the last few years are many times that. The reason why it falls off a little bit at the end is because there's a bit of a time lag between an item being published and us discovering it, because the way I usually discover things to put on the archive is through references in other things, and that takes a few years to work its way through the system. So you can see that there is a growth over the 3 decades through which EDRA collects items. Why is this? Well, in the report, there is some detailed speculation, and I test various hypotheses for that. It is likely to be due to a combination of greater interest in this particular field and also a wider growth in scholarly productivity. Certainly, in the scholars are within academia are under greater pressure than ever to publish or perish. And that has led to an explosion in scholarly publication across multiple fields, and the field of research in European Jewish populations is no exception to that. We wanted to know who does this kind of research, who researches European Jewish populations. The figures here are a little bit complicated. I will try and walk you through that. Excuse me, my thumbnail video is hiding the thing on the right, so I'm gonna, there you go. Okay. So there are 1,402 authors recorded on the system. Obviously, some works are co-authored or authored by a team of people. We also have 592 editors, people who have edited books to which all or some of which are dedicated to EDRA relevant themes. Interestingly here, 481 of those authors are not, of those editors are not recorded as authors, which is an indication that of something we'll talk about a little later, that a lot of research on European Jewish populations is published in scholarly collections and journal articles that are not about European Jews specifically, or even Jews specifically. One of the things we found is that a small number of authors have a disproportionate impact on the field. Only 29% of authors have contributed to more than one item, and that holds true over all the 3 decades that EDRA records. Only 41 authors contributed in all 3 decades. You can see in the diagram on the right, which is a visual representation of how a small number of very productive authors have a disproportionate impact on the field, but there are a lot of people who enter this field occasionally for specific purposes. I'm pretty sure that the number of PhDs we have recorded on the archive is an underestimate. But one of the interesting things here is, of the 75 PhD authors that we have, how many of the people who did PhDs in EDRA relevant areas went on to author other stuff? In other words, how many of them went on to have scholarly careers in this field? And we found 61% did. It's hard to know what to contribute, how to interpret that figure, but at the very least it shows that there are plenty of people who do research on this area, but as a one-off and don't necessarily go on to pursue a career in it. One of the things we've looked at is who publishes research on European Jewish populations. We record the genre of publication, and you can see the breakdown in the diagram on the right. As one might expect, about 30% of the items in the archive are scholarly journal articles and a few special issues. About a quarter are reports. And what I mean by reports is what is sometimes known as grey literature, which is publications by an institute like JPR. One of the interesting things is that the proportion of reports doubled between 1990 to 1999 and 2010 to 2019. The reason for this is almost certainly due to the growth in organizations across Europe that issue regular anti-Semitism monitoring reports. As I said earlier, there is no one home for this field. There is no one publisher. There is no one journal that dominates. We recorded 600 publishers on the archive, and 37% of these publishers are responsible for more than one item. And those average about just under 8 items each. So once again, you have a disproportionate impact of a minority of publishers within the field. I identified 145 publishers as loosely Jewish or specializing in issues of Jewish interest as well as anti-Semitism. And 80 of those are responsible for an average of nearly 10 items each. So once again, there is a hardcore of publishers that specialize in this area, but not to the extent of dominating everything. 30% of scholarly journals are responsible for more than one item. Of the 63 Jewish-related scholarly journals, they have a disproportionate impact on the field, as one would expect. I haven't recorded on this PowerPoint, but the most impactful, if you like, journal in the archive is East European Jewish Affairs. But beyond that, one of the interesting things is a lot of Jewish scholarly journals only have 1 or 2 items in them in the archive. So Contemporary Jewry, which is the major Jewish social scientific journal, has a surprisingly few number of EDRA relevant items. If you look at their holdings, what they publish, the majority of it is to do with American, North American, and Israeli Jewry. Here is a list of the top 20 countries represented in the archive. Note here, of course, that some EDRA items cover multiple countries. For example, the report on anti-Semitism that JPR did for the Fundamental Rights Agency of the European Union covered, I can't remember how many it was 8 or 9 countries, might have been a bit more than that. We can see that nearly 25% of all items covered the United Kingdom. That was the top country, if you like, with Germany, France, Russia, and Poland and Hungary coming closely behind. One of the things I tried to do here was to see if there was a correlation between the size of a country's Jewish population and the number of items on EDRA. And it turns out that there is. And it's a correlation between the absolute size of the Jewish population, not the relative size. In other words, it's not a correlation with the proportion of Jews in a particular country's populations. However, this correlation does allow for a number of outliers. So in the main, the bigger the Jewish population, the more research there is. But there are some notable exceptions here, one of which is Poland, which has just under 9% of total EDRA items, but has a very small Jewish population. In fact, this is a considerable underestimate because subsequent to completing this report, I did discover several dozen more items dealing with Poland. So it is likely to be even more of an outlier. It's possible here that France, which has Europe's largest Jewish population, is an outlier in the opposite direction, in the sense that we might expect a little bit more research on it than has currently been done. What we haven't found is that there is no correlation between the wealth of the country measured through various different statistics and the number of items. So in other words, in some of the poorer countries within Eastern Europe, in the former Soviet Union, we cannot find a correlation between that and the amount of research that has been published on it. There is a weak but still existing correlation between the historical experience of a particular country's Jewish population and the number of and the amount of research on it. So, for example, 34% of items are tagged with at least one former communist country, whereas former communist countries constitute 24% of the European Jewish population. So there's a bit of overrepresentation of research into these Jewish populations. We also found that Jewish populations in former communist countries, places like Hungary or Poland, are more likely to be studied in conjunction with other former communist countries compared to Western Europe. So it's much more common to find, for example, a study that looks at the Jewish population of Poland and Hungary together than it is to find a study that looks at the Jewish population of France and Germany, or France and the UK together. Where Jewish populations are very small, there is a lack of dedicated single country studies. There are quite a few countries that we have represented in the archive where the only research that we have about them is within the context of a multi-country study. So the Jewish population of Luxembourg is somewhere between 500 and 1,000. I forget exactly what it is. And it has been mentioned a little bit in research, but not in dedicated studies devoted only to the Jewish population of Luxembourg. One of the things that we found that perhaps isn't a surprise is that English is the dominant language in the archive. I have worked extremely hard to try and ensure that I discover non-English language items. Google Translate helps a great deal here, as well as personal contacts. But nonetheless, over 66% of items on the archive are in English. And the next largest language is French, with just under 10%. What we also found is that 55% of items that do not include coverage of an English-speaking country are published in English. That sounds a little convoluted, so I'll explain it a little bit better. But basically what that means is a modest majority of items on non-English speaking countries are published in English. There are some indications, or I could not prove it definitively, that items covering former communist countries are disproportionately more likely to be published in English compared to, say, places like France and Germany. That may be a sign of research commissioned by international Jewish NGOs, of which there was a fair amount, particularly in the 1990s, during the period of post-communist reconstruction. One of the things we were very keen to do in the archive to make it as useful as possible was to ensure that every item had a robust list of tags attached to it. And there are over 300 tags available that you can search by on the archive, but we've boiled them down to 7 main tags, and those main tags are exclusive. You can only be tagged with one one of these tags. And these are identity and community, anti-Semitism, culture and heritage, demography and migration, Holocaust and memorial, education, and other. And this graph shows the distribution of these 6 main topics. And you can see that just under a quarter of items are tagged with identity and community. And what that loosely means is that these are studies about Jewish life as it is lived. The next highest being anti-Semitism at just under 20%. If you look at the lowest bars in the graph, you can see that education is only 8% of items in the archive, and that is something that we will come back to in a minute. We wanted to see whether this distribution has changed over the time that EDRA covers. One of the things you can see here, if you look at the greeny blue section of the first column on the left and compare it to the greeny blue slice of the column on the right, you will see that demography and migration was much more prominent a research priority in between 1990 to 1999 compared to the most recent decade. Conversely, you can see if you look at the dark blue band, and you can see how that grew over the decades, that covers anti-Semitism. You can see that has more than tripled over the time that EDRA has been around. And this is one of those findings that made us quite confident of the data, because this is something that I think you would probably expect, because anybody who has even a passing involvement in Jewish policy making and certainly in Jewish research would know that new organizations and studies have popped up in the last few years to study anti-Semitism across Europe, and it's become a much more urgent research priority than it perhaps was previously. Concomitantly, one of the reasons why demography and migration has become a declining proportion of interest is because migration in particular was a massive issue in the post-communist period. You had a very large aliyah from the former Soviet Union and other former communist countries. You also had significant immigration of Russian Jews to Germany. And also demography more generally was a pressing Jewish communal concern at that time. It's certainly in Britain because of concerns about Jewish continuity and intermarriage, which sparked quite a bit of research as a response to it. So we think, therefore, that in broad terms, the subjects that are studied in Jewish social research in Europe do have some connection to the priorities that Jewish communities and community leaders have. Having said that, it is not. There are some striking exceptions to that, and again, education is a big exception. If you look at the 4, I think it is JDC Europe reports that are surveys of European Jewish leaders, you'll see that education comes very high up the priority list of European Jewish leaders. And whilst the proportion of research on Jewish education has more than doubled, it's still less than 10% of research on European Jewry in the archive. The distribution of these main topics varies across countries, and this is quite a complex area, and I do go into it in some detail in the report. But just to highlight a couple of things, there is a correlation between the population size and the proportion of identity and community and demography and migration items. Now, what that means is this: the larger the Jewish population size in a particular country, the more likely it is that there will be a significant amount of research on basically living Jews, about the way Jewish communities work, about counting Jews, and about tracking Jewish populations. In countries that have very small Jewish populations, and when there is very limited amount of research. That limited research is unlikely to be on those areas. It's much more likely to be on things like anti-Semitism or on Holocaust memorialization, things like that. So therefore, we can tentatively say that research on living Jewish communities and on living Jewish life appears to require a certain critical mass of Jews to generate research on. Education, in a way, is a special case. It is the lowest proportion of all main topics. The UK has 19% of education items. 13 countries over the more than 50 that we cover have no education tags at all. 13 countries where we know there is a Jewish school have no items tagged with the Jewish schools tag. It seems that educational research only seems to emerge once countries have sustained a much wider Jewish social research field. We lack very, very basic data on Jewish education in Europe. Whilst we can count with a little bit of web searching which countries have Jewish schools, we have no idea what percentage of Jewish population in most European Jewish countries are educated in Jewish schools. We don't know who funds them. We don't know much about their curricula. Basic information like that is missing across Europe. So to summarize, we've seen a growth in the field since 1990. Much of the field is dominated by a small core of researchers with a long-term commitment to the field, some of whom are on this call, with a much larger periphery of occasional contributors to it. There is a similar small core of publishers and journals that have a disproportionate impact, although none of them dominate. The amount of publications per country is correlated with the size of Jewish population, with some notable exceptions. And identity, community, and anti-Semitism are the most popular topics. The distribution of topics shifts over time in response to changing communal priorities, and countries with small Jewish populations are less likely to support research on living Jewish issues. And what we can say across most countries is that there is a lack of development of research on Jewish education. So what do we do with this? What do we do with these findings? JPR cannot make normative statements about what the field should be or what it should look like. It is not appropriate for us to be prescriptive. And in any case, even if we did want to be prescriptive, it's very unclear what the ideal quantity and distribution of research should look like. How much research should there be on Jews in Germany as opposed to Jews in Hungary or Poland? It's very difficult to set certainly a quantitative benchmark. The only exception to that, one area where we do feel quantity in making a normative statement, is education. We can say confidently that whatever the proportion of research on Jewish education in Europe should be, we're not there yet. We suggest, instead of setting a normative standard for the field, we do suggest a number of questions that researchers and organizations consider. One of them is, should there be an overarching purpose to the field? Can we speak of research on European Jewish populations as a field that is going in a particular direction for a particular aim? And even if we think there should be this overarching purpose, who is the one to set it? What should be the driver of the field? Who should be funders? Who should be the researchers? How do you identify funders? And indeed, how and where should the field grow? In what communities is research most needed? And what topics require further investigation? How might research careers be supported? And what kind of infrastructure needs to be supported or built? We raise these questions, and although we might have ideas on how individually as JPR, as an institution, and me as an individual researcher might have ideas about how we would ideally answer them, but it is not up to us to answer them alone. We need your help here, and we want to try and spark some kind of conversation about these questions, because as far as we can tell, these are questions that have not been asked before in the European context. They are sometimes asked in North American jury, but certainly not in European jury. And that is what we want to leave you with, is for the people in this webinar and those who read the report to start to think about those questions. So there we have it. We invite you to visit the European Jewish Research Archive. And in particular, if you are an active researcher, please put us to the test. Type in, look for your stuff. And if we don't have it there, we should have it. So please send it to us and we will be happy to put it up. And if there's research that you know about that you think, particularly if it's not in English, that has been published, even if it's not been published by you, that you think we need to know about, please tell us. Because this work is a lot easier the wider our network is. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Keith. Fascinating stuff. It's a tremendous piece of work, and full credit to you for working so hard on it and just giving us a view of something that, as you said, is very difficult to create. Methodologically, it was difficult, but also I think just to have a view on everything that's been done in terms of Jewish research over 30 years is an extraordinary achievement. I've just to say to everybody watching, if you've got questions and you want to put to Keith, the easiest way to do that is just to jot them down in the chat. There's a button there at the bottom of your screen, so feel free to use that. But I wanted to kick off by asking you, Keith, a few questions of my own. Some of them you've touched on. I just was maybe push you to go a little bit further. The first thing I was really struck by was in your first kind of substantive slide where you showed the progression of items by year that are on the archive, and you see this growth happening from 1990 certainly up to about 2015-16, and then the decline, which you explain that's due to the lag. But basically the picture is one of more and more research being done. And you said that is that might be fueled in some way by the sort of publish or perish idea that's become more and more prominent in academia, I think, as we all know. I just wonder whether there isn't something else at play there, which is just the emergence of the internet over that period, and that there just being much more material available, and it just being much easier to self-publish, and that being a factor there. So I'm just curious to know, I mean, I guess the other factor that also kind of occurred to me looking at that is, is it just harder to find stuff that was written 25 years ago than a year ago, for example? So how, I mean, how real do you think that finding is, and to say more about it?
The internet certainly has made publication easier. It's easier than ever to submit. I'm just about old enough to remember when you had to send typescripts to journals to publish things and to work with typists and things like that. And certainly it's much easier to do now. But in terms of whether this is a real finding or whether it's just that some items from the 1990s have dropped into the memory hole of history, I don't think that is the case in terms of some items. In terms of scholarly journals, if you look at the literature searches that you can do via things like Google Scholar, most back issues of journals going back decades are properly logged there. There will be some very obscure journals that won't be there. So in terms of unambiguously scholarly publication, I think we can be fairly confident that we can track it certainly way beyond 1990, I think. In terms of grey literature, in terms of reports, that's a much more complicated thing. It is certainly likely to be the case that a lot of stuff that is produced, for example, by a Jewish organization that doesn't publish much research and will do a one-off report, it can often be very ephemeral, right? It can often, even if it's put on a website, the website can change and you have to find it when it's there. And if no one cites it, then it's almost like it never happened. The internet has made reports like that much more easy to distribute and circulate, which means there is much more chance of it making a trace. so we can discover it. But then, so we have to therefore be modest about at least that section. It's quite possible that in the 1990s there is more stuff that was published for a very, very small number of readers and that never made it out into the wider world. But we also don't know. We don't know for sure.
Okay, thank you. That's helpful. Let me throw another one at you, which is for me, I think the most interesting chart in the whole report. I even jotted down the page number for those people who have the report in front of them. So on page 34, it's figure 5, and you showed it in your presentation. It's when you look at the 1990s and the 2000s and the 2010s, the distribution of reports on the 7 different topics that have been identified. And you talked about how identity and community, even though they comprise the largest single group across the 3 decades, are in a state of decline over that period. Demography and migration also have declined, and anti-Semitism has grown from 8% of the whole to 27% of the whole. And I know we sort of agreed before this that we wouldn't make kind of normative statements or we wouldn't make judgments, I guess, on that. But I'm really struck by the growth of research on anti-Semitism, and as you said, also the sort of the decline or the sort of the lack of education, lack of research on education. So I don't know what are your thoughts on how things have changed? Is what we're seeing a positive change? Is it simply reflective of the concerns that exist out there? Is there some sort of corrective that we ought to be aware of in the world of Jewish research? What's your take on that?
I think there's always anti-Semitism has always been a popular topic. I don't think that ever changed. What is new is organizations issuing systematic monitoring reports year after year after year. The Community Security Trust in Britain has been doing it for decades, but often modeled on the CST's work. We now have organizations across Europe doing it, even in places with quite small Jewish populations like Denmark, who are producing that. And it's starting to become one of these things that Jewish communities do, that is seen as a core function for even a small Jewish population. Beyond that, there can be, I see research as a good thing. So if it's on research, I'm not saying research on anti-Semitism is a bad thing, but if you compare the research on anti-Semitism with the research on education, and also if you look at also research on Holocaust remembrance and stuff like that, and it does worry me a little bit, I have to say, because one of the things that Jewish education is about is a statement of faith in the Jewish future, a statement that we will continue and that we will bring up a new generation. And yes, Holocaust remembrance is important, anti-Semitism is important, but I do think perhaps that it's not that we need less research on anti-Semitism, but we do perhaps need to even it up a little bit. And that certainly monitoring on a very basic level, producing regular monitoring figures on the number of people in Jewish schools in a particular country should also be seen as part of the core function of main Jewish organizations in the same way that they now see anti-Semitism monitoring. Can I just, we seem to be getting Q&As and chats.
Yeah, I was gonna take you through them.
I just wanted to just say a general point before we take them, because I just want to emphasize that those main topics, they're only the tip of the iceberg. we have hundreds of topic tags, and most items have 3, 4, 5, 6, and sometimes even more tags attached to them. What those main topics are is ways to very broadly categorize what they're doing. I would suggest people have a look at the other tag, because there is an incredible variety of stuff. So Margaret Harris, who happens to be my mother, asked, is there stuff on interfaith activities and the Jews involved in interfaith activities? A lot of that other stuff is on precisely that. There is a field of research on interfaith and dialogue and stuff like that. And perhaps at some point when we get more of a critical mass, we'll create another main tag on precisely that. And I think Jonathan Webber mentioned something about, I can't see, about Haredim. We have tagged Jewish denominations, and there is a tag for Haredi Jews. What I haven't done, and I probably should have done, is to see whether the amount of research on Haredim has increased over the last 3 decades. And I don't know what the answer to that is, but I would say that research on Haredim often comes from a very different place than a lot of research in the Jewish community, because certainly in the UK and also in Antwerp, there's a lot of research on the Haredi community and deprivation. So things on like housing and poverty, and also medical research or public health research, things on there's been research on vaccination hesitancy in Haredi communities. So it has a very different shape to it.
Yeah, I would also add on Haredim that it's, a lot of the research that we've managed to do in the UK on Haredim has been through the census. So by having a religion question in the UK census, we're able to identify hundreds of thousands of Jews, and just by looking at their geography, we can identify, and their household size, we can identify Haredim. So it's often having a data set like that allows us to do much more research than perhaps other countries that don't have that, because in surveys of the Jewish population, it is typically hard, like the Haredim are one of the sort of well-known and identified groups that are difficult to reach. So I think research work on Haredim is a challenge, but one that certainly at JPR we're very keen to try to address over time. There's a question about demography and migration. Could you say a few words about how new citizenship laws, for example, in Portugal, Spain, Austria, the question is whether they're being studied by JPR, but I think the question is more, has that issue come up in EDGRA, and are we seeing any growth in that sort of material?
Yes, I mean, particularly if you look at Germany in the 1990s, one of the things you see, and actually even up till now, there's a whole research field, particularly so for even government organizations in Germany were commissioning research on how to integrate this new population into Germany. And the the Russian Jews in Germany are still the focus of dedicated studies even today, often 30 years later, since, I mean, there's still some coming, but the majority have already come. And you're starting to see something similar in Spain and Portugal. I'm not sure about the Austrian case, I'm afraid, but there has been some research and writing about the new citizenship laws in Portugal and Spain. Although, having thought about it, I haven't seen anything done by the Spanish or Portuguese governments or quasi-government or quangos in those countries on this. But then again, these people who are taking up Spanish and Portuguese citizenships are mostly not doing it in order to immigrate there in the same way that Russian Jews did to Germany. So it's a slightly different sort of thing. I mean, there's it's another area where we have very limited information, is how many people have done it, why did they do it, where did they come from. I know there's been a little bit of work on British Jews who got European citizenship in preparation for Brexit, although even that I think is more about collecting people's stories rather than anything quantitative. Not that there's anything wrong with qualitative research.
And the other thing I would just add to that is, I mean, just to get from a JPR perspective, one of the initiatives that we've set up, actually also funded by Rothschild, in the last couple of years, is the European Jewish Demography Unit. So there's a whole there's a whole new unit within JPR that is looking at demographic issues, and within that, the whole issue of passports and citizenships is becoming like one of the things that we know needs to be looked at in more detail. So I just to add, I do hope that we will see more of that. There's another, I think, I'm conscious of time, so we need to
wrap. Literature one, I think.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. So it's come from Margaret Greenfield, who talks about, she's written 2 quite substantial reports with Eleanor Kaufman in the last 4 years, but they were confidential. They were done as, I assume, as sort of commissioned pieces of research for local authority, one for a local authority, one for the Jewish community. And I could say much the same about, a whole vast array of JPR work, because that we do for, that's commissioned privately, that never sees the light of day because it's an internal piece of work for an organization. So I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. Is there a way to kind of to even if we can't publish the reports, to sort of capture that the work that's being done kind of, behind the scenes in some way?
Well, I mean, there is an argument actually that for in terms of the data analysis that we did for this report, and that might do in a few years' time, that stuff in a way shouldn't be counted, because what we're looking at when we're talking about a field of research, what we're looking at is these individual items are, even if no one cited them, are potential contributors to that field. Whereas something that is done as a private report cannot be that. On the other hand, it's certainly useful to do it. Now, it's really weird that this was mentioned, because JPR is in the process of moving office, and Richard Goldstein came in today and has dug up some JPR reports that we don't have on the archive, because here's one that was done for the Liberal Jewish Synagogue in synagogues in 2003. So should we put them on the archive? And actually, I haven't told John and Richard what I think about it then, but I would say, actually, for historical purposes, why not? They're not going to embarrass anybody now. Obviously, we need to get permission. So I'm wondering whether, that's in terms of grey literature, that actually, years after the confidentiality is no longer an issue, that it still has a value for historical purposes to make sure it's archived, because that's one of the things, actually, if you look at the early years that EDRA covers, it's really fascinating historically. That's not why we built the archive, but it is a resource to historians. So, for example, you could see on the archive how it that Jewish leaders were reacting to the fall of the Berlin Wall and to the end of communism, and what agendas. Now, in future years, grey literature is going to be a fabulous resource, and it tends to get lost.
Yeah, I'm very conscious of time, because we need to wrap up very soon. But I do think it's an interesting question. And by the way, one of the things that we try to do when JPR's commissions to do a piece of research is to encourage the commissioning body to allow for the study to be put into the public domain. And I think it's interesting. Even if they were to say no now, you're right. I think it's worth going back to them maybe 5-10 years later and say, could we do it now? But that takes a bit of planning. I just want to throw in one very last question, and then just one from Olaf Glöckner about Israel diaspora relations. Is there, just something about publications on European Jewish Israel relations? Just say in 2 sentences what
the answer is. There is a huge amount of research now on Israeli expatriates in Europe, particularly in Berlin. In fact, research on Israelis in Berlin seems to be a field of its own. And yes, there is research on European Israel relations and diaspora relations more generally. I just briefly want to take also András's thing in the Q&A that you might have missed, John. What are the quality control to the collection? There is limited quality control, in the sense that it isn't really our place to make those necessary to make those judgments. On the other hand, on a case-by-case basis, there have been things that have been published that do seem to be unsustainable and unsupportable, and have become notorious within the field for that reason, that we have excluded, even if they made sometimes be of historical use.
Okay. Keith, thank you so much. Our time has run out, but Keith, thank you so much for sharing what you've done and for sharing your findings. It is genuinely, I think, a fascinating insight into European Jewish research, and it raises lots and lots of questions. And I hope that we've managed to, at the very least, kind of scratch the surface of some of them today. And obviously, if people want to carry on the conversation, feel free to email us and certainly download the report from the JPR website, www.jpr.org.uk. And again, just to repeat the appeal earlier, feel free to search the archive for yourself if you're a researcher and feel like your work should be up there, and just to check whether it is, and if it isn't, then please let us know. And not simply just you, but if there are fields that you have expertise in, have a look at those and see if there's work that you feel is missing. It'd be really helpful to us to do that. I want to, just to close up, hand over to the chair of JPR, Stephen Moss, just to say a few final words. Over to you, Stephen.
Thank you, John. What a fascinating hour we've all had. Really, really stimulating and interesting. And as you've heard, we're now in the fortunate position of having an online archive of publications from the last 30 years from 54 countries. The objective of which, as Richard explained, is to help more research become available to policymakers and to encourage greater cross-country and greater inter-researcher collaboration, which is key. And Richard's report, I think, makes it clear that there's no single source for this research. And that's why we believe what we've done plays a really important role in making that research more accessible and also more easy to navigate. I really enjoyed a lot of it, and like John, I found the chart on the distribution of the main topics particularly interesting, and Keith's comments on the dearth of reports on education is certainly something that we'll pick. As John has explained, we now have for the last couple of years have an evolving European demography unit that's really beginning to add to this area of research generally. And some of the comments about not having reports on smaller Jewish communities in Europe is something that we are tackling, and so there's more to come, and we're very keen to play an important part in that. So really, it falls on me just to say a big thank you to Keith, thank you to Richard for his support, to John for hosting this webinar, and of course to Sally Berkovich and the team at Rothschild Foundation Hanadev Europe, without whom we just wouldn't be able to do this. And so I think you all agree it's been a fascinating hour, and I want to thank you all for joining us from various parts of the world. It's wonderful. This is the one good thing about the pandemic, is we're all doing more of these international Zooms, which are working really well and enabling us, more of us, to communicate with each other and to learn off each other too. So thank you all very much for joining us. And as John said, do keep in touch with us and contribute freely to what we're trying to pull off here. That's really great, and have a good evening. Thank you.